I'm sure you know one. A person who grew up an Orthodox Christian and no longer identifies as Orthodox, or perhaps even Christian. In fact, I'm confident you know far more than just one. Most of the people I grew up with fall into this category. And if we don't change the way we do ministry, we'll see far more young people fall away from the church in the years ahead. So what exactly is the problem? Where are the church's ministry efforts falling short? What are the basic ministry mistakes we make as we introduce young people to the church? This is a big question, and we could try to answer it by appealing to data and/or other big picture abstract metrics. But I don't want to do that right now. Instead, I'd like to share a story. The story of a young woman I met a few years ago, because her story is far more common than we'd like to admit. Her story can help us look at the ministry mistakes we make in a concrete and focused way, because only then can we identify them and hope to address those mistakes in the way we do ministry. So, meet Catherine. Catherine is a young adult who I met during a young adult event a few years ago. She's what we often call cradle Orthodox. She grew up in the church. She was raised within the church. In fact, she was probably more active in the church than most people I know, and yet today she's struggling to identify as Orthodox. So what happened? When she was a kid, Catherine was involved in everything. She attended youth group and Sunday school. She was a member of the parish dance troupe and on the roster of several parish sports teams. She was at the parish more evenings than she wasn't. And all that changed when she graduated high school. Catherine went from being involved in everything to being involved in nothing. After a few years of being completely estranged from the church, I met her as she was deciding whether she could come back. She was looking for a new young adult group to join, something to take the place of her old youth group. And I realized that this pursuit reflected a deep problem in Catherine's life, a problem that stems from the way we've been doing ministry. You see, Catherine wasn't really looking to reconnect with the church, the mystical body of Christ. She was looking to join a new group. Why is that troubling? Because Catherine was looking to join yet another group for one simple reason. She never felt like she was truly a member of the church. In fact, being a part of the church wasn't even on her radar. Like I said earlier, Catherine's story isn't unique. Far from it. But it's powerful because it perfectly distills a basic problem we're facing as a church. Because here's a young woman who appeared like a model youth group participant, a success story, and yet all those years of apparently successful ministry culminated in her disengagement from the church. Rather than lead her to become a faithful Christian, all that ministry led her to becoming a former Christian. And she's not the only one. So how big is the problem? In the United States, a nationwide study by the Barna Group found that about 60% of young Christians fall away from the tradition that raised them. While we lack similar data focused specifically on the Orthodox Church, the numbers that we do have aren't encouraging. In 2010, the Assembly of Canonical Orthodox Bishops conducted the first ever census of Orthodox Christians in the United States. I actually participated in this project when I was in seminary and contacted every parish in the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese of America. The census found that there were 799,400 Orthodox Christians in the USA. So that's one good data point we can use as we zoom out from Catherine's story to look at the bigger picture of Orthodoxy in America, but we need another. Well, in the early part of the 20th century, the Christian Herald newspaper used to publish population data for various Christian groups in the United States. The last time they included the Orthodox Church in such a study was in 1947, when they reported that there were 702,273 Orthodox Christians in the United States. If we accept these numbers, that means that the population of the Orthodox Church in the U.S. rose 14% over about 6 decades. Not too bad, right? Maybe not. Unfortunately, in the same period, the total U.S. population more than doubled. Had the Orthodox Church grown at a similar rate, had our growth kept pace just with the normal growth of the American population, we'd be counting more than 1.4 million members today. But we aren't. We're only looking at about half that. I grew up in the church. I've worked in the church at both the parish and archdiocesan levels. I've spoken to thousands of Orthodox Christians across the country. And based on everything I've seen, none of this is surprising. I've done a bit of informal surveying with some ministry colleagues. And while we haven't had the resources to do really big data collection, we have found that youth disengagement in the Orthodox Church is about on par with wider American Christianity. We seem to be losing between 60 and 70% of our young people, depending on which jurisdiction we're talking about. And I was curious about the rate of disengagement I've encountered in my own life, so I did the math. I counted up all the young people I grew up with, former Sunday school classmates, former youth group members, even extended family, and I found that about 90% of the young people I grew up with have fallen away from the church. I know this is anecdotal and a bit more extreme than the rest of the data we've collected, but it's unfortunately not surprising, nor is it unique. In fact, when I share this 90% number, people have told me that they've experienced similar loss in their own communities. While the Orthodox Church may not be able to quantify the problem as precisely as the Barna Group did, the little data that we do have seems to reinforce the experience of so many ministry leaders. Young people are falling away from the church at an unsustainable rate. Whether it's 60% or 70% or 80% or 90%, it's a problem. But the good news is that people aren't simply falling away from the church. And understanding that, what people find compelling in the church, can help us better diagnose what's causing people to leave. So while we need to be honest about just how widespread this problem of disengagement has become, we can also be reassured that there is good news. There's more to the story than disengagement. Many parishes in the United States welcome new converts to the church every year. In fact, this seems to have only increased in the past year. More and more people have stumbled onto the church through online materials, like the work Father Andrew is doing with Ancient Faith Radio and the work we're doing at Y2AM. And according to most reports, a significant portion of this group, maybe even the majority, are young adults. And this actually fits with some of the data that the Pew Research Center has discovered in recent years, namely that the Orthodox Church tends to skew younger than other Christian groups in the United States. I've personally corresponded with and met in person hundreds of these young adults in the past few years. When I lead young adult events across the country, a significant number of self-identified converts are always in attendance. And these converts include teenagers as well. In fact, while leading a retreat, I recently met a high school senior who was in the process of entering the church. She's now an Orthodox Christian, and I've heard from people even younger than that who, after watching the videos Y2AM produces and experiencing the beauty of the Divine Liturgy, took the incredible step of becoming Orthodox Christians. So, while a substantial number of young people are falling away from the church, an impressive number are entering at the same time. Why? Why do some leave while others join? The National Study of Youth and Religion suggests that there are 3 factors that contribute to a young person's decision to remain connected to the faith tradition that raised them. These factors are whether 1. The faith was practiced at home, 2. The young person knew someone outside the family who practiced the faith seriously, and 3. The young person had a spiritual experience that brought them closer to God. As Seraphim Dankert summarized this, one could therefore say that a person is most likely to retain Christian faith throughout adult life if he or she had 3 meaningful and healthy relationships in their early to mid-teenage years. 1 with faithful Christian parents, 1 with a faithful Christian mentor outside of the family, and 1 with God himself. So these factors at least help us understand why young people who grew up in the church fall away. But they also help us understand why young people enter the church. I've certainly seen this in the young adult converts that I've met or corresponded with. In my experience, they all point to 1, the influence of someone who took the faith seriously, and 2, a religious experience. Sometimes this is the influence of a friend. Sometimes this is the influence of a clergyman, and sometimes this is the influence of a favorite author or podcaster who helped bring them into the church. As far as religious experiences, this can be anything from a visit to a monastery or a first experience of the Divine Liturgy. Whatever shape they take, these relationships and experiences help lead young people into the loving embrace of the Church. They help counteract the challenges that have come to define young adulthood today. When we contrast the story of Catherine, who fell away from the Church, with the story of other young people who entered the Church, we can see that healthy ministry meets the challenges that young people face in their lives, while ministry mistakes fail to meet those challenges, and thus lead young people to grow, not into faithful Christians, but former Christians. So, what exactly are these challenges? Well, if you've ever listened to Pop Culture Coffee Hour, you know that Christian and I have learned a lot from the work of philosophers like Charles Taylor and James K.A. Smith. Specifically, we found their explanation of the nature of our secular age to be incredibly enlightening, and it's had a lot of influence on our ministry work. Their work sets up the vision we offer in our online ministry training course, Effective Christian Ministry, which has helped hundreds of clergy and lay ministry workers change the way they lead young people to Christ. The analysis of thinkers like Taylor and Smith, and our own conversations with thousands of people across the Church, have led us to focus on 3 big challenges that young people face today. These are 3 challenges that complicate life and, when left unchecked, can lead people further away from the Church. And they are 3 challenges that, because of our ministry mistakes, young people are often left to deal with on their own. 1. Doubt. 2. Loneliness. 3. Uncertainty and choice paralysis. Let's start with doubt. Doubt has become a staple of the modern religious experience. Trapped as we are in what Taylor calls the cross pressure between faith and doubt, all of us experience doubt in some form. People who try to identify as believers are tempted by unbelief, but it works the other way as well. People who try to identify as non-believers are tempted by belief. I've spoken before about my struggles with doubt, and I've yet to meet a Christian who hasn't had their own version of this story. What's more, I'd be lying if I said that my doubts live firmly in the past. Rather, doubt is perennially present, and not just for me or for other believers, but even for those who don't believe. The difference is that they doubt their unbelief. Consider Apple co-founder Steve Jobs, who, despite not believing in God or the afterlife, was especially tempted by belief in the divine in the final months of his life. Or consider the opening lines of Julian Barnes's novel, Nothing to be Frightened of. I don't believe in God, but I miss him. To quote James K.A. Smith, the doubter's doubt is belief. We all live in the cross-pressure between faith and doubt. Of course, as a ministry worker who's trying to help young people know Christ, I'm primarily concerned about the doubt that leads young people away from belief. These kinds of doubts have deep roots in contemporary culture. For a variety of reasons, which we explore in greater depth in Effective Christian Ministry, we live in a world where people rely on the power of science and technology, rather than God, to make the world whole. We are firmly grounded in a world that makes sense in purely physical and non-spiritual terms. In our contemporary age, for example, it is no longer God who heals the sick, it is medicine. The sun is no longer a god that gives life to the world, it is a ball of gas burning millions of miles away. Which, on one level, isn't bad. Our bodies are made of chemicals, and medicine does heal them. The sun is a giant ball of gas that we can observe and measure. Our scientific advances have taught us something about the world. But we've also lost something about the cosmos because, in short, the world has become flat and purely material, merely immanent, with no room for spiritual realities or God's providence. The presence of the divine is no longer assumed to be a basic fact about the cosmos, but is an idea relegated to temples and cathedrals where the devout can pay homage to spirits in the privacy of their own minds. We've reached a point where God, in a sense, is no longer loose in the world. He is just an idea that has been flattened along with everything else. With this flattening of the world, creation has become unhinged from the Creator. The cosmos which he made and ordered is no longer based in supernatural realities. Instead, it has become a merely natural universe that makes perfect sense without God. God may or may not be added to the mix, and this is precisely where that cross-pressure between faith and doubt enters in. It's really up to you and how you decide to make sense of your experience within a world that has a felt sense of being flat, whether you're a believer haunted by doubt or an unbeliever haunted by faith. God is not necessary in our postmodern story. We feel like we can explain the world without him, but that doesn't necessarily mean people have strong feelings against him either. As I mentioned earlier, we often see people longing for a character who largely feels absent from the story. The doubter's doubt is belief. That's what flatness is about in a secular age. So why does this matter for the church? Because I can't help but wonder if our ministry work also makes perfect sense without God. And I can't help but wonder whether our ministry work is unintentionally feeding the doubt that leads people away from Christ, because we too have bought into the myth of a flattened universe where God is, at best, a good idea, rather than seeing the church as the real yet mystical presence of Christ's own body on earth. I can't help but wonder whether our ministry is institutionalizing young people, teaching them that the church is a mere human organization that leads programs and activities that make perfect sense without God. To the extent that God fits in with our model of ministry, I can't help but wonder if we see him more as an idea we need to agree with rather than a person we need to encounter. I wonder if we have flattened what the church actually is. I can't help but wonder whether young people find it so easy to fall away from the church because we've made the lived experience of Christianity flat and empty, a collection of activities and programs that don't ever lead to an encounter with the living God, a God who would surprise us with his presence and shatter the possibility of the empty, purely physical universe that we all, including those of us who lead ministry, take for granted. This is our first big ministry mistake, making the lived experience of Christianity flat and programmatic. Doubt, riding on the coattails of imminence, has become a staple of the modern religious experience, something that we in the church unintentionally fuel. We have cut ourselves off from Christ's body and therefore from one another as members of his body, and all this makes for a very cold, lonely, and isolated existence. But this isolation isn't just in our heads, the intellectual byproduct of an amorphous and uncertain religious landscape. It's a very real thing that affects our sense of self and community. That's why we need to talk about loneliness. The health insurer Cigna recently conducted a study of 200,000 adults which revealed that loneliness is far more than a problem. It's an epidemic. Here's some of what they found. 46% of Americans report sometimes or always feeling alone. 43% of Americans say they sometimes or always feel that their relationships are not meaningful and that they are isolated from others. 20% report that they rarely or never feel close to people. Only 18% say they feel like they have people in their lives they can talk to. 53% of Americans report having meaningful, in-person social interactions on a daily basis. Things like having an extended conversation with a friend, spending quality time with family, etc. Perhaps most surprising for our purposes, the study found that Generation Z, adults aged 18 to 22, are the loneliest generation of all. So why does this matter for the church? Because so much of what we call ministry centers on programs and activities, and people defend this ministry model by arguing that it at least brings people together in the church. But I can't help but wonder that this isn't a real coming together, that this isn't real Christian fellowship, where two or more are gathered in the Lord's name. I can't help but wonder whether our ministry programs and events are doing a far better job of helping people pass the time than make the most of the time, offering diversions and entertainment rather than facilitating honest and vulnerable encounters with God through our meaningful encounters with one another. I can't help but wonder whether this is why so many coffee hours are so full of small talk and so empty of genuine communion, which is why so many young adults report feeling so alone in even the most crowded social hall. This is our second big ministry mistake, reducing fellowship to a series of impersonal encounters that don't actually bring people together. Loneliness has become a chronic modern problem, something that is exacerbated by the way we do ministry. And the more young people feel adrift and on their own, the more they feel uncertain about what their lives are actually for. And this takes us to the third challenge we're exploring today, because in my experience, one of the biggest struggles that young people face is a deep uncertainty about their lives. I don't mean this in the big picture sense of doubt or cosmic questions about whether or not God is real. I mean something far more down to earth. A choice paralysis that prevents them from taking their next step and actually living as Christians in the world. Very real questions like, who am I? Why am I here? What is my lifetime for? Bubble to the surface when all divine presence is pushed aside or dismissed altogether. When we forget the God in whose image we are created, we forget ourselves, resulting in deep existential uncertainty. This uncertainty and choice paralysis can manifest in relatively small ways, where a young person doesn't quite know how or why to fast or pray. And it can manifest in larger ways, where a young person doesn't know what to look for in a potential spouse or what kind of career, much less a vocation, to pursue. So why does this matter for the church? Because many ministry activities are great at enticing young people to show up, and people defend this model by arguing that our primary goal should be to keep kids in church, even if that means prioritizing cultural and athletic activities over spiritual pursuits. But I can't help but wonder if our approach is more of simply calling young people to gather in a shared interest group, where our ministry efforts are designed for young people to remain passive recipients of ministry rather than to become active participants in the life of the church. As we've already noted earlier, these activities make people more a part of a group than members of Christ's very body. This is our third big ministry mistake, reducing the Christian life to passive participation in programs. I can't help but wonder whether this is why Christianity is becoming more an abstract thing we believe and less a concrete way of life. Perhaps this is why it's easier to identify as Christians because of our religious upbringing, rather than actually be Christians through engaging an ancient set of practices that bring us into deeper and truer communion with the living God. I can't help but wonder whether the less we emphasize lived and embodied practices, the more young people's lives and hearts are open to the formative practices that lead them further away from Christ and His church. And what exactly are these practices? And why are they so important in addressing our ministry mistakes and paving the way for a vision of Christianity that can inspire young people to remain engaged in the church? Let's start with a simple example. Modern psychology, following the wisdom of the church fathers, offers guidance on ways to respond to negative thoughts with positive ones. For example, if a person is struggling with thoughts of jealousy, this can be combated with thoughts of gratitude. The mind can be directed away from what it lacks and refocus on what it has been given by God. And this becomes an opportunity for thanksgiving and deeper communion with God. In a similar way, the challenges of doubt, loneliness, and uncertainty aren't necessarily problems. Experiencing any of these struggles won't inevitably lead you to fall away from the church. In fact, quite the opposite is true. With the right mindset, we can turn them into opportunities for Christ-centered ministry that will invite young people into a deeper experience of God and His kingdom. This is a fundamental truth about ministry. God encounters us, not in our strength, but in our weakness. When we're fat and happy and everything is going great, we feel like we have no need for God. And that's not where He meets us. Instead, the Lord meets us at our lowest point, when we are hurting, when we are struggling. The Lord meets us in the darkness and loneliness and terror of the tomb. He ministers to us at our lowest point so He can raise us up to the heights. The same is true when we look at the basic challenges young people face in their lives. These are opportunities for ministry. But to do this, To make the most of this opportunity, we need to counteract the tendencies that push people into negative directions with practices that lead people back into positive directions that point the way to the Lord. Specifically, 1, we can counteract doubt with the practices of faith. 2, we can counteract loneliness with the practices of fellowship. 3, we can counteract uncertainty and choice paralysis with the practices of discipleship. Let's start with the practices of faith. Doubt can lead young Christians to question God's very existence, to see the world as cold and empty and meaningless. Recall the first big ministry mistake which we identified earlier, making the lived experience of Christianity flat and problematic. Approaching the life of the church in a flat and programmatic way doesn't baptize the challenge of doubt into an opportunity for ministry. Instead, it helps lock people into the darkness of their doubt. This is why young adults like Catherine, despite spending years involved in the ministries of the church, emerge from these ministries as former Christians. Former Christians who are, at best, looking for new groups to which they can belong, rather than communion with the living God. So, when asking how we can reorient our lives in a direction of faith, the question becomes, what kind of practices can help us to see God as present and active in the world? The scripture points us in the right direction, advising us, be still and know that I am God. Cultivating a spirit of stillness and silence helps open our hearts to the Lord's presence. We make silence an important part of every Be the Bee retreat we offer, or at least used to offer in the long ago before the pandemic. And it's no wonder that participants find it to be such a powerful experience that calms their hearts and reassures them by bringing them into greater awareness of the presence of God. Imagine if this were a bigger part of the way we do ministry. Imagine if, rather than lecture young people every chance we get, we simply sat with them in quiet contemplation. Imagine if we prayed with them, not simply in a rushed or formal sense, but in a deeply intentional sense. If ministry workers took 20 minutes to sit with young people in silence and even taught them how to fill that silence with prayer. Yet, the practices of faith seem to make us uncomfortable. In fact, they're often something for which we offer apologies. At many youth ministry events, for example, you'll see a leader announce that we are going to pray really quick before we get to the fun stuff, and behind the scenes, the leaders who plan an event often worry about making things too spiritual or too churchy. I wonder if this is because we too are drinking from the cold cup of immanence. Ministry leaders also feel the gravitational pull of a flattened world keeping us down, no less than the young people we serve. So much so that even we can feel it's almost absurd to reach towards heaven. And when we do this, when we worry about making ministry too spiritual or too churchy, we suggest that prayer and communion with God isn't a good enough reason to gather, that it's, at best, secondary. But maybe we should have faith ourselves that gathering together with the express purpose of prayer is more than enough of a reason to gather, and that no fun activity is needed to make this a night worth attending. After all, if our goal is merely to offer fun activities to bring people together, we are fighting an uphill battle against the world. The world will always have more fun than we can offer. Yet we focus on fun because we're ultimately unsure about whether the presence of God is enough to make an event worthwhile, or maybe even in some cases whether He's really even there. We doubt. And so rather than facilitate experiences that deepen faith, we create programs and events that deepen unhealthy doubt and lead people further away from faith. As if God has left the building and we're all in on the secret but are keeping it from young people. But imagine if doubt was a thing we were comfortable acknowledging and addressing. What if we responded to doubt, not with judgment or shame, but with bowed heads and fervent supplication? Imagine if we modeled for young people the instinct to offer all things, whether joyful or sorrowful, to God in His infinite mercy. Imagine if we were a people who constantly had prayer on our lips and in our hearts, both the wise words of the services and the authentic and spontaneous outpouring of prayer in our own words. Imagine if we intentionally gathered for the express purpose of crying out to God. commending ourselves, one another, and our whole shared life to Christ. Indeed, this shared communal act would bridge the gap into true fellowship that combats our deepest loneliness. Now, let's take a look at the practices of fellowship. Loneliness can lead young Christians to retreat inward, isolating themselves from their brothers and sisters in Christ. And when the church offers nothing to heal their loneliness, it can lead them to abandon the church altogether, choosing instead to find a place in other communities where they can be known and understood more intimately. Recall the second big ministry mistake which we identified earlier, reducing fellowship to a series of impersonal encounters that don't actually bring people together, but rather bring them around a shared interest, much like the Young Republicans or Young Democrats or some other political or social group. We actually see this in the church when we refer to our groups as for young adults or young professionals. This approach highlights their demographic interests rather than the mystery of the church. But approaching the life of the church in an impersonal way doesn't baptize the challenge of loneliness into an opportunity for ministry. Instead, it helps lock people into the darkness of their loneliness. This is why young adults like Catherine, despite spending years involved in the ministries of the church, emerge from these ministries disconnected and on their own. When asking how we can reorient our lives in a direction of fellowship, the question becomes, what kind of practices can help us to truly open our lives to each other in the Lord's name? Again, the scripture points us in the right direction, reminding us that when we feel trapped in our isolation and despair, a welcoming ear can make all the difference. I sought the Lord, and he answered me and delivered me from all my fears. If God gives us his ear, we should also lend an ear to our brothers and sisters. We make listening an important part of every Be the Bee retreat we offer, and it's powerful to hear how many young people are comforted by the simple experience of being heard, a thing that is far too rare in their lives. Yet, the practices of fellowship seem to make us uncomfortable. At many youth ministry events, for example, you'll see an emphasis on extroverted experiences that are bold and intense. And when we promote these programs and events, we tend to highlight these large and loud gatherings as the centerpiece of what ministry offers. When we do this, we suggest that a deeper sort of connection in and through Christ with our brothers and sisters isn't a priority. But maybe we should have faith ourselves that gathering together with the express purpose of knowing others and being known by others in the Lord's name is more than enough of a reason to gather, and that no party is needed to make this a night worth attending. After all, if our goal is merely to offer superficial get-togethers, we are fighting an uphill battle against the world. The world will always throw better parties than we can. Yet, we focus on big and loud group activities because we're ultimately unsure about whether coming together in the Lord's name is enough to make an event worthwhile. And rather than facilitate experiences that deepen our connection with each other, we create programs and events where people get lost in activities that, while potentially enjoyable, aren't life-giving. But imagine if loneliness were a thing we were comfortable acknowledging and addressing. What if we responded to loneliness, not with distractions or diversions, but with vulnerability and face-to-face encounters? Imagine if the church offered not simply opportunities to pass the time, but encounters where people could make the most of the time they spent with each other. Imagine if we taught people how to listen to each other, to really be present for the people in their lives, not simply physically, but spiritually and emotionally as well, with every aspect of their being. Imagine if we acknowledged just how many of us feel lonely. Imagine if we responded to this loneliness, not with indifference or denial, not by avoiding the pain through fun diversions, but rather by actively creating spaces in which we felt safe to be vulnerable, to truly be known by our fellow parishioners. Imagine if youth gatherings were places where we could share in Christ by sharing in one another's sufferings, much as the Lord shares in our suffering on the cross and in the tomb. Imagine if we modeled for young people the presence and attention that is a necessary element of any genuine community, a place where people can share their joys and sorrows, a place where people can be truly known in a spirit of Christ-centered, unconditional love, not just in a shared interest group called orthodoxy, but in a fellowship of solidarity in Christ. A loving family, the household of God. Imagine if young people really felt that the church was a place where they knew they could bring all their fears, doubts, and questions, so that they were comfortable that no matter what uncertainty they carried about their lives, they wouldn't have to face that uncertainty by themselves. This would pave the way, both practically and organically, for us to walk alongside young people as they navigate the world as disciples of Christ, which brings us to our last point. So now let's look at the practices of discipleship. Uncertainty and choice paralysis can lead young Christians to stall, to stagnate in their lives and spiritual development. Without concrete direction, young people simply won't know how to live as Christians in the world on a daily and ongoing basis. And this uncertainty can lead them to seek direction from other sources, whether they be self-help programs or other religious traditions. Recall the third big ministry mistake which we identified earlier, reducing the Christian life to passive participation in programs. Approaching the life of the church in a passive way doesn't baptize the challenge of uncertainty and choice paralysis into an opportunity for ministry. Instead, it helps lock people into the darkness of their uncertainty. This is why young adults like Catherine, despite spending years involved in the ministries of the church, emerge from these ministries with no idea how they should actually live as Christians in the world. After all, it's hard to follow Jesus if you haven't really been taught how. And it's even harder to follow someone you don't really know. Once again, Scripture points us in the right direction, emphasizing the need for clear next steps to help guide the lives of young people. Train children in the right way, and when old, they will not stray. The Office of Vocation and Ministry, who bring the church incredible ministry work like the Crossroads Summer Institute, has a fantastic model for helping young people find their place as Christians in the world. They define vocation as one's unique and ongoing response to Christ's call to love God with heart, soul, mind, and strength, and the neighbor as oneself. It's a definition we've really taken to heart with our ministry work at Y2AM, especially our development of ministry resources like the Y2AM Ministry Plan, and it's something we try to live out as we engage with the culture in Pop Culture Coffee Hour, wrestle with deep questions of belonging in We Are Orthodoxy, and creative bring timeless theology into our cultural context with video series like Be the Bee. This definition of vocation helps clarify what we're getting at with the practices of discipleship. Yet, the practices of discipleship seem to make us uncomfortable. In many communities, for example, you'll often find an over-reliance on vague statements, exhortations to pray more and fast more without concrete direction on how to do that or what that's even really meant to do. And you'll find a tendency to explore spiritual matters in abstract and theoretical terms rather than through actions and habits that can be applied in different situations. But imagine if uncertainty and choice paralysis were a thing we were comfortable acknowledging and addressing. What if we responded to uncertainty, not by encouraging passivity and silence, but by encouraging people to take risks and find ways they can best offer their talents to the glory of God? What if we actually welcomed the voices of young people into the center of our shared life as they wrestle with how to find themselves in the middle of God's actions in the world? What if we took their suggestions seriously? Imagine if the church offered young people a clear vision of who they are and what their lives are for. This would mean that the church would give not simply vague statements about Christianity, but concrete guidance on how each person can best live uniquely as a Christian. Imagine if we really saw the church as a body made of many members, each of which play a unique, valuable, and distinctly indispensable role in the life of the whole. Imagine if we invited young people into positions of responsibility where they could explore their talents and actively discern God's call. Now, if we did this, it would definitely be a risk. It might even cost us some comfort because these young Christians might push against the status quo and encourage us to think more broadly and deeply about our place in the world and whether we actually practice what we preach. I mean, really imagine if we encouraged people to be creative and courageous as they try to figure out what gifts God has given them and how best to use those gifts for the life of the world. It would ruffle some feathers. Imagine if Christianity weren't just a thing that was an important part of our lives, but rather the whole of our lives, where nothing is more important than our relationship with Christ and our walk into the kingdom. Because if that were really true, then we'd be willing to part with anything that didn't deepen that relationship and move us closer to the kingdom. Okay, let me wrap this all together because I've thrown a lot at you. A flawed vision of ministry has disrupted the spiritual lives of multiple generations. Yet, while many young people are falling away from that interest group we call orthodoxy, many others are finding their way into the church. And these trends are closely related. Just as people fall away because of a lack of spiritual mentorship and experience, they are drawn to the church precisely because of those factors. Young people struggle with 3 particular challenges that are hallmarks of our secular age: doubt, loneliness, and uncertainty, or choice paralysis. And the best way for us as a church to respond to these challenges is with practices that counteract these negative trends, specifically the practices of faith, fellowship, and discipleship. We've laid an important foundation here. In his video, Father Andrew Stephen Damick will explore how we can renew our vision of the church and articulate a timeless gospel for today's young people. And he's going to start with a pretty basic question. What's the point? This is an important question in everything we do as the church. Why? Why do we do what we do? What's the whole point of coming to church? Saying prayers, keeping fasts, giving alms. If we can't offer a compelling why for young people to be involved in what we're doing, then we can't really be too surprised when they find more compelling stories they want to be a part of elsewhere. So now, I'll turn you over to Father Andrew for his talk, and I'm really looking forward to our retreat on April 3rd, where we'll get to answer your questions and explore these important topics with even greater depth. Thanks, and God bless you.